Well, welcome to the 700 Club, and thanks for joining us. Our first story, we go to Iran, where stopping Iran from building a nuclear weapon has been a big challenge for Israeli leaders for now 2 decades. Now a showdown may be coming.
One former Israeli general has first-hand experience in destroying nuclear threats. He's proposing 5 steps Israel can take to stop Iran. Chris Mitchell brings us this CBN News exclusive interview from Jerusalem.
You're listening to the sound of Israeli pilots destroying Iraq's nuclear reactor in 1981. 26 years later, Israeli pilots destroyed this nuclear reactor in the Syrian desert. Retired General Amos Yadlin took part in both attacks. He flew with 7 other F-16 pilots to destroy Saddam Hussein's reactor in 1981. And as chief of military intelligence in 2007, helped plan the attack inside Syria.
In a way, maybe I'm the only human being on the globe who was involved in destroying 2.5 nuclear programs. And I guess we are discussing tonight the half.
We are, exactly. Tell us, General, what makes Iran in 2021 different than Iraq in 1981 and Syria in 2007?
The Iranians are ready for a possibility that attack will be launched against their nuclear facilities. So they put them under the ground, in bunkers, in tunnels, in mountains. They disperse them. They have a redundancy of programs, and they don't want to reach the nuclear bomb as fast as possible. They want to reach the bomb as safe as possible, not to pay the price.
In this exclusive CBN News interview, General Yadlin said the change in U.S. administrations had an impact on Iran.
After they see the change of administration in the US, they lost their fear, so they are breaching all the agreements on what they are allowed to do in the nuclear field.
Yet he still believes Israel can stop Iran's nuclear program and laid out 5 steps he believes could make it happen. One is a stronger diplomatic agreement that blocks Iran's path to a nuclear bomb. The second is sanctions or other means to make Iran pay a heavy price for its nuclear program. Third is covert cyber and clandestine operations.
Number 4 is Air Force taking off. It's a military attack, as it was done in Iraq and Syria. And number 5 is a regime change, because I think we can sleep good at night if there is a regime that's not calling for the destruction of Israel.
Yadlin says over the years, U.S. presidents from both parties declared their commitment to the state of Israel. Now he wants to put that in action.
I think the wisdom that we need in Jerusalem is how to take this title. We are committed to the security of Israel and make it an operational contingency plan agreed by the 2 countries.
A major obstacle? The U.S. and Israel look at Iran differently.
Iran is not existential threat to the U.S. Iran, with nuclear weapon, is existential threat to Israel.
With the recent attacks on Iran's nuclear program, Yadlin puts Iran about a year or a year and a half away from a nuclear bomb. He says Iran needs to enrich uranium to weapons-grade level and develop a nuclear warhead to be able to build a weapon. Now the race is on to see if diplomacy or military action will stop this threat to the existence of the Jewish state. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, I'm not sure diplomacy is going to work. The Iranian government is clearly taking advantage of our change in administrations and is now looking to get very aggressive in building up their nuclear capability. For Israel, this is absolutely unacceptable. If you cannot have Iran with a nuclear weapon, with a ballistic missile that could deliver that to Tel Aviv. That same ballistic missile can reach capitals in Europe, but it can't reach the United States, at least yet. They don't have that capability to be transcontinental. So for the U.S., it's not an existential threat, but it certainly is to Israel, so they can't do it. They can't allow this to happen. You go back to the history and what we just saw back in the early 1980s, Israel took out Saddam Hussein's attempt to acquire a nuclear weapon. Then during the Bush administration, they delivered all the intelligence that was needed to show that the North Koreans were helping Syria obtain nuclear weapons, and they had a reactor specifically designed to enrich uranium to do that. The Bush administration blinked. They didn't take a coordinated action with Israel, and so Israel had to do it on their own. It shocked the world, but it was necessary because, again, Israel can't allow Syria to have a nuclear weapon. What will happen now with Iran, where they're obviously being sophisticated? They've learned the lessons of Iraq. They've learned the lessons of Syria. They're not concentrating this into one particular location. Israel's tried to do it with viruses, with other kinds of attacks to slow their progress. But the more they do that, the more Iran responds by distributing it. For the world, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, what does that do to the Middle East? What does that do for Israeli security? What does that do for ongoing peace? And the answer is it completely disrupts it. Within their eschatology, their particular view of end times, in order to usher in the Mahdi, the new prophet promised in the Quran, in order to usher that era in, the world needs to be in absolute chaos. So for them, developing and then deploying a nuclear weapon fits within their religious view, fits within their cosmology. They absolutely have declared that, and they absolutely have declared that they want to wipe Israel off the map. We need to take that very seriously and do whatever is possible to keep them from developing a nuclear weapon. Well, in other news, because that was pretty bad news, in other news, we can all breathe a little easier. The escalating tension between Russia and Ukraine has now been diffused, at least temporarily. John Jessup has that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That is right, Gordon. Russia's defense minister has ordered some of its troops to start pulling away from the border with Ukraine. He sent them back to their permanent bases following massive drills amid the tensions with its neighboring country. But he said they should leave their weapons in western Russia for another exercise later this year. The U.S. and NATO have said the Russian buildup near Ukraine was the largest since 2014, when critics say Russia illegally annexed Crimea. Well, here at home, the Biden administration filed an appeal this week to find a way to force doctors and hospitals to perform potentially harmful gender transition surgeries on patients, including children, even if those healthcare professionals have religious objections. The Daily Caller reports the appeal hinges on the interpretation of a clause in the Obamacare law, which led to a mandate that required doctors and hospitals to provide the surgeries upon the referral of a mental health professional. That mandate did not allow for religious or conscience objections. The appeal comes in a lawsuit by religious doctors, hospitals, and clinics. Well, the Senate has overwhelmingly approved a bill that would help fight the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Currently, more than 80% of Asian American adults believe violence against them is increasing. The measure would speed up the review of hate crimes at the Justice Department. CBN's Caitlin Burke has more on the signal of support for the Asian community.
The U.S. experienced its first major COVID outbreak in March and April of last year. Right alongside, unfortunately, came a dramatic spike in anti-Asian hate crimes.
People are telling their grandparents and their parents not to go outside. People are telling their children not to go play outside, even though the weather is nice. And it's been over a year of these sorts of feelings, and in recent weeks have only increased with our attacks on the elderly and the murders in Atlanta, Georgia.
Attacks like this, too brutal to show in its entirety. A 65-year-old Asian American woman kicked and stomped while walking to church in New York City. In Oakland, California, 2 cars belonging to Asian families set on fire. Overall, these kinds of hate crimes up by nearly 150% in 2020.
In the Asian American community now, we are fighting 2 viruses, right? We are fighting COVID-19 and anti-Asian hate virus.
Both played a part in Kim Horrigan's decision to keep her 8-year-old son out of school when it reopened for in-person learning.
It doesn't matter if you're Chinese American. It doesn't matter if you're born and raised here. As long as you're Asian, you're the target.
In order to prevent attacks, state and local officials are increasing patrols in Asian American communities while encouraging the public to report any incidents. Federal lawmakers hope a new bill will back up those efforts.
This legislation, quite simply, gives resources to make it easier for our federal government to record this data, and makes it easier for victims to report this data.
The bill would require the Justice Department to make investigating COVID-related hate crimes a priority and provide local police with more resources to respond to the violence.
This is the first time that we will stand up as a body to say that we condemn these kinds of crimes, and we're going to recognize it for what it is, hate crimes, and we are going to do something about it. This is very bipartisan, and I worked very closely with Susan Collins.
Now that the Senate has passed the bill, the Democrat-led House plans to follow suit. It then heads to President Biden, who's expected to sign it into law. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Thank you, Caitlin. Well, for the second straight year, the democratically controlled House of Representatives has passed a bill to make Washington, D.C. the 51st state along party line votes. But it failed in the Senate last year and faces a similar uphill battle again, even though Democrats have the edge there now. CBN News Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson brings us that story.
If signed into law, H.R. 51 would add 2 Senate seats that would highly likely be Democrats, leading Republicans to argue this is a power grab by the majority party. But House Democrats passed the bill despite their objections.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Democrats say it's all about giving representation to 700,000 residents who live in D.C.
The truth is, there is no good faith argument for disenfranchising over 700,000 people, most of whom are people of color. These desperate objections are about fear.
And they described the bill, which passed 216 to 208, as pivotal to their voting rights platform and a way to restore equal citizenship. Republicans counter, calling the D.C. Admission Act an unconstitutional power grab.
The only reason the Democrats are doing it is trying to get more electoral votes and more senators.
CBN's David Brody discussed the bill with the top House Republican, California Congressman Kevin McCarthy.
And why they're doing it when they are, because they know they're going to lose the majority. It was never created or should be a state. If there's anything it should do, it should go back to Maryland from that standpoint, if they want to be within a state, but it's unconstitutional.
Under current rules, the bill needs 60 votes to break a filibuster in the Senate. President Joe Biden supports the bill, but GOP senators are questioning where the president, who campaigned on uniting the country and working together, is hiding.
The crazies who are running the ship. And so I'd like to see the Joe Biden we served with escape from the basement and come out and say, all right, we're not going to break the system.
Even if Senate Democrats do away with the legislative filibuster, it's not clear they have enough support to pass D.C. statehood. And other progressive priorities like court packing don't seem likely to pass the Senate either. Reporting from Virginia, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
All right, thanks, Abby. Gordon, back to you.
Well, it's a curious argument. The argument for statehood coming from the left, statehood for D.C., is that somehow the residents of the District of Columbia are disenfranchised. So you have 700,000 people. That's the number. Well, what about the disenfranchisement of 328 million Americans so that 700,000 get 2 Democrat votes in the U.S. Senate? This is clearly a power play. There aren't any noble aspirations here. They want to solidify a majority in the Senate and do that by manipulating the system. From the beginning, how the state of Virginia and the state of Maryland contributed their land. Maryland gave the most. They gave their land away to the federal government in return for a pledge that the District of Columbia would never be a state. That was the deal that was made by the Founding Fathers. From the very beginning, D.C. was never supposed to have a voice in the Congress. That was the entire intent. To now say, well, we're disenfranchising people. No, you're not. If you want to have a senator represent you, well, there's plenty of room in Maryland. You can go live. There's plenty of room in Virginia where you can go live, and you can have that representation. We need to keep the status quo of what the founders put in place, and they were quite intentional. D.C. is federal property. It should never be a state.